Hello, my name is Anna Zalewska. I'm a creative producer at Papaya Young Directors, the educational initiative and competition for young filmmakers organized by Papaya Films, the production house. And in Papaya Young Directors, this is really important for us to get the educational aspect through, not only production-wise and filmmaking-wise, but also idea-wise and values. So here today with me are Linda Codega from Shotsnet. Hi, Linda. And Natasha Mwansa, a journalist and filmmaker and finalist of a previous edition of Papaya Young Directors. Hi, Natasha.
Hi.
So today we're going to take on the topic of diversity and inclusion, both in front and behind the camera. So we're going to go through some examples of good practices and people that make difference already, and think of more of the solutions than the problem itself. But obviously we will try to start with pointing out why the problem is occurring and why we need to talk about this. So if for starters you could just introduce yourself and talk about your experience and background a little bit. Linda.
Sure. So my name is Linda Codega. I use they, them pronouns. I am a transgender non-binary person. I am a features editor for shots.net. So I spend most of my day watching advertisements and then writing about them. In addition to that, I do a lot of reading and writing on the side, and I really focus on the craft of filmmaking and the ways in which craft and like larger themes intersect. And I'm also on the DE&I committee for my larger company.
Okay, thanks. Cool. Natasha, could you tell us something about you?
Yeah, so I'm Natasha Mwansa, and I have a background in journalism mainly, but I'm a very new filmmaker, and I also write for film and television as well. A lot of my kind of style and narratives are kind of based within that sort of transition between drama and humor, and making kind of light out of dark situations and experiences. And yeah, I just kind of move more into filmmaking nowadays.
Cool, thank you. So again, for everybody that's joining us right now and forward, we're going to talk about diversity and inclusion, both in front and behind the camera, and the practices that we could take into consideration and just put into action to make people and their perspective more welcome and just include them into our storylines. So what do you think was the most triggering moment that make us all take this conversation and start this disputing about why minorities are not there already and how to put them in front of camera? Linda.
I think that there's a lot of moments. I think that the conversations that we've been having about police brutality in America since about 2014 with the murder of Michael Brown have really impacted the ways that we view television and media as important reflections of our culture. I think that the current climate is very, very clearly influenced by the murder of George Floyd last summer and the sort of string of police brutality that has sort of come to light pretty consistently since then. And I think that just like the violence that has been experienced by minorities and people of color is just making all of us take stock of our complicity in all of it.
Yeah, and what do you think, Natasha? We were talking about it a little bit before, but both of you are based on different continents and different places. But do you think the same points are triggering the discussion whenever and wherever?
Definitely. So I'm based in London, and a lot of what happens in the States does always kind of translate here as well. But I do feel like when the George Floyd murder happened, we kind of paid more attention than usual. I don't know if that's because we're in the pandemic and we kind of had that time and space to really look at what was going on. but we really took notice and we started to reflect on what kind of inequality and brutality looks like here as well. So I definitely think the George Floyd murder opened up the conversation wider, but it also made us look at other industries. It wasn't just about police brutality. It was about fashion and beauty. It was about film and television. It was about the 9-to-5 jobs that we all have and how we feel in those spaces when, especially when we're outnumbered as minorities. So yeah, I do think, you know, a lot of what happens in the States does kind of show up here as well.
And could we point some stuff that should be done and maybe discuss a little bit, why is it so hard for us to put those values into action? And basically, why is it so hard for us to think of people that are different from us and then think of them as well when, you know, preparing content and looking for a crew as well? Natasha, what do you think?
I think from a creative standpoint and from a standpoint of making content and filming content, I think what happens a lot in the filmmaking industries is already it's dominated by people who tend to be white, a lot of them tend to be male. And so already it's quite difficult for minorities to kind of fit into that place. Filmmaking is quite you kind of need to have money or to come from a certain background in order to go through the training that it takes to like train as a director or a cinematographer and all of those kind of skills. And there are loads of different kind of structural reasons why minorities don't get those opportunities. But on a kind of smaller level in terms of hiring creative crew, I think what happens a lot is that people hire their friends. So when we're in situations where already there's a certain demographic of people who are taking up space in that kind of field, if they're hiring their friends, most of the time that means people who look like them. And it can be difficult to kind of look beyond what you're familiar with and think of, you know, the unfamiliar, because this is what you see every day. This is what you engage with every day. And so I think that's one thing that, you know, a lot of well-meaning creatives overlook.
Mm-hmm. And Linda, from the more of a, like, you know, I would say theoretical observer, because Natasha is a creator and I love the difference in perspectives of both of you. What do you think were the other reasons, and what are other steps that we need to take?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I think accessibility, like Natasha said, is a huge systemic problem that is kind of the root of a lot of what's happening and like why accessibility isn't given to minorities and why minorities aren't invited into spaces. I think that if agencies and clients and even production companies like started mentorship programs or training programs or anything that sort of prioritized getting accessible, like this sort of training accessible to minorities and people who don't have those sorts of privileges at an early age, I think that would be super helpful. I think that kind of putting things into writing would also be super helpful, because there's a lot of lip service done towards diversity and inclusion, but very rarely is it actually like put into action or codified in any like real way. And I think it might not be like super easy, but it might be like an easier thing for clients to say, like, we want like 20% minority ethnicities on this project, or you need like at least 50% women working on this project. I think that if clients and agencies and production companies kind of like take that into consideration when they're like approaching work, it would be really, really helpful. I think the other thing is to make sure that the people behind the camera and the people in charge of the story match the people in front of the camera. There's been a lot happening where people of color and minorities are given time in front of the camera, but that diversity is not reflected in the people who are making those films. And I think that that's a problem. And it's also like difficult to say, like, if you're like shooting a promo about like Black people, maybe like have a Black person behind the camera, because then of course Black people sometimes get pigeonholed into like, oh, you're a Black director, and Black people of course are just like, we're directors. And same thing with like queer people. It's like, oh, this is a trans story, like we should get a trans director. I'm like, you should, but you should also just make sure to like just a director. So it's a double-edged sword, but I think that kind of setting those expectations early on before anyone is even hired, like before anyone is like brought into a company, all those are like steps that are actionable that you can take to sort of combat the systems at work within your own corporate structures.
So I remember from our previous conversation that this really important point came out, education. So what we're talking about right now is based on something that the groups that we're talking about that are, you know, underrepresented are basically declined education somehow, not really declined maybe, but have harder access, and it starts over there already on this stage. But also taking care no, but thinking of decision makers, because what you, Linda, said is really important, that it's not only the creators, we focus on them because Papaya Young Directors is all about directors and filmmakers, but obviously it's all about people around them as well. So Linda, if you could just embrace this topic a little bit with the lacking of access to the educational point as well.
Yeah, I think that we've sort of got to start reframing what education is, and like who gets to determine like what qualities require experience, you know, like if someone doesn't have a fancy art school degree, but they have, you know, like a portfolio of Polaroids that they took out of their basement, that portfolio shows promise. We should be able to honor that talent. We should be able to honor that perspective. I think a lot of it comes down to personally like relinquishing the ideas of power that like we have in ourselves. Like, for example, I have a 4-year college degree, but like if I really wanted to be very, very much like an ally to queer and trans communities and people of color, I would sort of relinquish that, and I would be like, that doesn't actually mean anything. That means I was given access to this university and I was like at this place for a certain amount of time, and I did some reading and I did some writing. But like releasing yourself of those markers of experience can sometimes lead you to having a better understanding of what practical education might look like for people who might not have traditional markers of education experience.
And Natasha, how did you start in filmmaking?
I just kind of started. I didn't go to film school, or I didn't have any formal training. I did go to university as well, but it was for English, a pretty unrelated degree. And I basically just started by, you know, picking up my phone or borrowing cameras from friends and just going out and seeing, you know, getting in touch with indie musicians in the local area and seeing if they wanted like things shot for them, and going to like cultural events and shooting little highlight reels for them. And I kind of went on from there. So it's very much, I didn't really have the support that a lot of my peers who are further ahead of me had. So yeah.
And I know that the topic that I've chose after talking to Natasha, neutralizing the minorities into the storyline, caused some controversies, because neutralizing from military doesn't mean too positive. It doesn't have too positive connections and connotations. But then I chose it because I love the perspective that you, Natasha, drove about showing minorities on screen and how to treat the stories where they appear. So if you could elaborate a little bit about that, and maybe we could discuss about this normalizing versus neutralizing, and maybe there's another word that we could use, because language does make difference, and it's really hard to change it. But then with language, the mindset changes. So it's really important. So Natasha, what about this neutralizing? Why?
So I think because a lot of people from marginalized groups do face hardship, whether you're from an ethnic minority, whether you're a queer person, whether you are disabled, you will have gone through some hardships. And I think a lot of the time, especially when you don't have people who identify with those different demographics sort of behind the camera and, you know, driving the creative process, there's a big temptation to kind of zoom in on those hardships and make that the story. And those stories need to be told, and those stories are important. But I think a lot of the time what we find is it's the only narrative that gets told. You have, you know, slave movies that are the only ones with, you know, majority Black cast that win major awards, but you won't have, you know, just like a Sofia Coppola type coming of age film where you just have Black kids being Black kids and going through heartbreak and puberty just like white kids do. And so I think when I personally think of making these stories neutral, I think of just having the same old stories that you would have and the same old themes and topics and subjects that you would have with majority white casts, but just, you know, maybe you have a gay person and they're going through work problems and relationship problems, but they also just happen to be gay. And of course, they'll have, you know, markers and things that they only go through that a straight person wouldn't go through. And I don't think we should erase that from the stories. I just don't think that we should continue to make those the focal points, because what happens is we then, if you don't belong to that community, that's all you see about them, and that makes you form certain ideas and really reductive kind of perspectives of what that community represents. So I definitely think that, you know, when we speak about neutralizing, we should speak about giving these different demographics and underrepresented demographics the opportunity to just have their stories told in the same way that people who are more represented do.
Linda, you're nodding because you agree?
Yeah, so I will personally like throw it out there. I don't have the same hangups with the word normalizing. I think that that's, for me at least personally, I don't mind normalizing trans people in the narrative, simply because trans people specifically are really going through a lot of shit right now. There's anti-trans legislation in America in like 33 states that's currently like going through those Congress, like the congressional process. So I think that for me at least, and for trans people, in my perspective, to normalize trans people would be like I would love that. I would love if people like treated us normal. That would be super great. But I also agree that like the idea of treating minorities and diverse people as a neutral in the world of like storytelling, where it's fun to see and it's interesting to like experience those perspectives, but it's not necessarily like the focus of the drama. And I think that there are a lot of like really great pieces of media out there that are doing that. I think one of my favorites is probably Schitt's Creek, with Dan Levy's storyline, where he comes out as pan and then he like marries another man, and I'm just like, It's just really cute. The drama is less about the fact that like he's a gay man in this very, very small town. The drama is the fact that like he's a dramatic little bitch, and every now and then he just like goes a little crazy. So I do agree that like neutralizing would be great. But I think that like when it comes to language, the more accessible it is, the better.
So no controversy, just stick straight to the point. But you introduced our next stage in the conversation, so examples, because you both started a little bit about that, and I would love us to go through mostly you, and if you want to discuss with others' opinions on some content, just do talk to each other. I encourage you to do that. So Something I believe quite important happened a few days ago. So the Directors Guild of America awarded Melina Muchaksa. I hope I pronounce it well, and I'm so sorry if I don't. So she got the Best Commercial Director award, mostly for her, I would say, manifesto, but still commercial for Beats by Dr. Dre. That was called You Love Me. And it was all about how we love what is about Black culture, but we don't particularly love the Black person itself. So I think that this manifesto is something that's really important that gets noticed, but something different from what we're talking about. So it's something that just shows the problem and like wants to start the discussion further. Maybe like, you know, dive into the topic. So this is a really example that I know Melina mostly from her music videos, but then this is something that's really stands out as well because it says what's wrong, and it got an award. So this is something that it's great that happened. But then if you were to think about people that represent the good perspective on the topic and like putting it into life with their content, like serious films or commercials. I would love to see more commercial, by the way, like neutralizing all the minorities that we've got around. So what would that be? And maybe if you were okay with that, we would start with the initiatives, the people that stands behind them, and then go through the content itself, or you can do whatever you want. So what do you think was the, like, maybe not think, but what for you is the first thing that comes to mind when thinking diverse on screen?
I think of Pose. There was a really great show. It's still going on, but it's all about like the drag scene in the 80s. Sort of like through today. It's really fantastic. Majority queer, Black cast. Yep, Pose is good. Euphoria, How to Get Away with Murder. And then I also, for like genre things, Bridgerton, which is historical romance, has a majority Black, or not a majority Black, but has like a prominent Black cast. As well as The Witcher. For some reason, they just decided like, we're just going to throw in a ton of Black people and people of color, and we are never going to question it. And I'm just like, yes, very good.
There were some questions though, because The Witcher is originally Polish. So there was a lot of controversy around it because, you know,
really?
Yeah, in Poland, it was like, you know, this tall, white-haired guy. And, you know, like, it's like cultural thing. Like The Witcher was ours, you know. It's like, of course, I'm making jokes of it, but there was some controversy in Poland around that.
I can see why that would happen, but at the same time, I'm just like, there are dragons. Like if you're upset that like there's Black people in this fantasy universe, but you are totally cool with dragons, like, I don't know, man, maybe you got your priorities wrong. But yeah, I think that those are good conversations to have, because like when I first watched The Witcher, I'm just like, oh, there is no like weird fantasy nation of Black people showing up. And I'm just like, perfect. They're just there. Everyone is just here. So I thought it was really well done. I really enjoyed the fact that like I didn't have to think about what it was doing. I was just like, just gonna enjoy the pretty people on screen. That's all I gotta do here. Gosh, what else? So I think with regards to advertising, I have a couple examples. I think that Stepped Studio, which primarily does like branded content, is doing a really great job with prioritizing minority voices. They did a recent piece for Altera that focused on Native voices and featured 2 Native skiers talking about connecting with nature and being a part of the countryside and like their sort of ancestral traditions that connect them with the world. That was really, really good. They also did a piece with a transgender hiker, where talking about like her transition and like how she's working out and like how she handled her relationships along her journey, like not only to like become this very, very prolific, well-known hiker, but also to as she transitioned into a more authentic life. So I think they're doing a lot of really good work. And I think the Starbucks ad from like last year, that was like, what's your name, where it showed a young transgender person trialing a name at Starbucks. Like when you go to Starbucks and they ask you your name and they call it out. And I've had that experience. Like I've done that at Starbucks where like I go and I give a different name and I'm just like, oh no, my name is Linda. Okay, I know now. But just like seeing those sorts of experiences, even fictional experiences shown in a way that is very compassionate, is really, really wonderful. So those are some of my examples, both from like fictional media and also like advertising. Also Moonlight.
Sorry?
Moonlight, the movie, makes me cry. Like I watched for like 5 minutes and I'm just like, I'm a wreck. I need to leave. I can't finish this film.
And I remember you pointed Euphoria as well, Natasha, but what was about this series that was that points the fact that this is really diverse perspective or diverse in the cast? Natasha?
About Euphoria?
Yeah.
I really enjoyed Euphoria. I mean, there are a few issues with it. It's not perfect, but in terms of just representation, I really enjoyed kind of seeing the different kind of ethnic minorities. I really enjoyed seeing a trans person on screen and I feel like her story was kind of portrayed in a way that never erased her transness, but also it was just about this young teenager who falls in love with the wrong person and is a little bit naive and just kind of needs a bit of guidance, which is all teenagers. And I like that was kind of the central storyline for her. But it still kind of drew on her identity as a trans woman, trans girl. So I really liked it for that reason. I do wish there was more representation in terms of darker skinned Black girls, just because that seemed to be something they overlooked. But I feel like in comparison to a lot of the teen dramas that we've seen, it has gone a bit further.
Mm-hmm. About this lighter skin Black people, there is the thread in, not a good example though in this topic, but still, Gin and Georgia, I think the title was, for Netflix. And this is something that's really interesting that comes out of there. The main character says that it's really hard for her to identify, because for Black people, she's not Black enough. And then for white people, she's generally not white. So this is a really important issue to draw forward as well, because it's kind of like discrimination like inside the discriminated groups as well. But what about other examples, Natasha? What do you think were the examples to follow?
So my favorite film of the last year is a film called Rocks. It's a British film, and it's about young schoolgirls. And the main character's mother leaves her and her younger brother to kind of fend for themselves. Her mum has mental health issues, and the main character has to essentially look after her brother and try not to get kind of found out by social services. And the whole cast, well, the majority of the cast are Black and people of color. You have a dark-skinned young Black girl as the lead, and her friend is a Muslim girl, which is like something you don't see a lot. But also I just love how, so the writer, I think her name is Teresa Ikoko, she's a Black woman, and she kind of identifies with the sort of background of that film is set in. So a lot of the writing and the dialogue is very authentic, very recognizable. I identified with it just because that was kind of the background I came from as well. So I saw my youth when I was watching that, and it seemed just so authentic. But one thing I loved about the process of that film is that it was very collaborative. I've seen some interviews with Teresa, and she talks about getting the cast involved. A lot of the cast had never acted before, and that kind of lended more to the authenticity, but also created opportunities for these young people to kind of break out of their sort of class divide and, you know, do something more and be recognized in a way that they might not have otherwise. But also she kind of spoke to people, young people from that community, and let them feed into the writing. And if there's ever an authentic way to do something, I think that's the way you do it when you're representing anyone who is underrepresented.
And wait, because I think that we didn't really answer that question before, but there are some examples that you point out, but why is it so hard then? Because there are like examples for a good work, but then what you said, Natasha, seems like it's just harder to, like, you know, to do, because it's harder to do a research, it's harder to find people to work, it's harder to think of the story. What's the problem there?
I think it's also very top down. It's about who gets the funding, and it's about whose work and voices are put in front of the people who make the decisions and who pay for these projects. I think a lot of the time, obviously, because the studios and production companies are run a lot by sort of white people from an older generation, it's difficult because, again, it is about who you know, and you're going to know people who look like you, and you're going to invite people who look like you into your spaces. But also it's about kind of old-fashioned ideas of what works for TV and film and what should be commissioned. And a lot of the time, if you're, you know, a middle-aged white man from, you know, a wealthy background, if you're presented with a treatment or a script that kind of spotlights, you know, young working class Black girls in East London, for example, and you don't recognize that world, that unfamiliarity can be the thing that gets you the no. And it's not a testament to the quality of that work. It's just that the person who signs off on that funding doesn't know what that world is. And so they immediately sort of turn away from it. So I do think it's very much a case of who gets picked to share their stories.
Linda, and what do you think about, like, you know, this judging process as well, like not only on the founding level, but then when the work is made already, because you're like Shotsnets are giving away their words, and then you're gonna read some scripts from Papaya Young Directors as well soon. And is it easy to cross this background away from the judging process itself?
Yeah, I think it's hard. And I think that part of it comes down to the fact that, like, you sort of have to focus on craft more so than anything else, because like I'm, for example, like at Shots and with Papaya, I am sort of using my personal taste to judge things. And I have to sort of remind myself, I'm like, my opinion is a singular vision of how I perceive this piece of work. And if my vision and like my taste doesn't align with like the taste level of something else, I have to be able to recognize that, like, oh, like I had this negative reaction, but like other people might not. And a lot of it is removing the ego from how I feel about things, right? A lot of it has to go from like, you know, I don't recognize this, it's unfamiliar, but I can still recognize that, like, this is good work. It's well crafted, it's well developed, it's considered, it's very intentional. And sometimes when that happens, like I might have to like pass it on to another editor, or like pass it on to another judge and be like, hey, I'd love a second opinion on this. Like, I think my taste level is just not aligned with this piece. So ultimately, a lot of it is sort of removing your ego from your opinion, and sort of removing your ego from the fact that, like, my taste is like my personal taste, and it's not a judgment on like whether something is actually good or bad. It's just a judgment on whether or not I enjoyed it. And I think that in our modern world, so much is centered on what people enjoy as a measurement of whether or not it's good or bad, that I feel like if we could just like take like some steps back from a lot of things and like remove our own personal feelings of value with like my opinion has value and like my taste has value and like I'm important because I'm a tastemaker. If we can sort of pull back from that perspective, I think that we would also gain a broader understanding of experiences that are not our own.
And if you were to kind of build a list of must-see films, series, commercials as a first lesson of acceptance and like accepting and learning diversity and inclusion, like inclusion for different perspectives than our own, what would that be? Like, what are the must-see and must-follow?
Paris is Burning is one for queer and trans and Black people in the city. I think it's a documentary. For those of you that don't know, it's a documentary on drag culture in the 80s, and it's very, very real, very raw, and it's like from the 88, 89 was when it was filmed, and it's sort of in the middle of the AIDS crisis as well. So I think Paris is Burning is a really good one, just in general. What else?
I'd also say I May Destroy You. I'm sure everyone by now has watched that, but if not, I May Destroy You by Michaela Cole is incredible, and it's an incredible example of, you know, something that's written by a Black woman, and it's very, very clear through the dialogue and through the sort of tone of voice that it's an authentic piece of work.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of things that are like specifically queer and trans, and there's so much out there, but it's also like so much of it is like so problematic and like may have been like revolutionary when it's published, like the one with Cillian Murphy where he plays a trans woman, like Messages from Pluto. But like at the time it was like really revolutionary, people really loved it, and now we're just like, yikes. Yikes. So it's hard because like finding those, especially for the trans community, we are often made objects, and we're often like a lot of media is committed to dissecting our thought process without like actually like honoring who we are. So there's unfortunately like a lot of pieces that were very influential but hard to say in 2021, like this is necessary viewing to understand like the trans experience. So unfortunately, I think that a lot of my recommendations are documentaries because that's like the best way to like portray the experience. There's another documentary. I'm gonna take a minute to look it up, but it's on Amazon, and it is a documentary about butch women of color who were at Stonewall Inn. And I think it's called The Furies. But yeah, so stuff like that I think is really important to like get those first person accounts.
Actually, a queer film that I really enjoyed was Watermelon Woman by Cheryl Dunye. And it's a film, I think, from I want to say 90s or 80s, I could be wrong. But she's a queer Black filmmaker who made an amazing film called Watermelon Woman, and it just goes into queerness, but also race and relationships and politics, and it's quite funny as well. And I think definitely anyone who wants to kind of look at things from an intersectional point of view should definitely go and watch that.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring another example to the table from Natasha, because we're talking about big productions and talking about difficulty in funding, but then you, Natasha, did a film for Papaya Young Directors where not only the minorities were like behind the camera, but you've chosen like your protagonists and people who are sharing their stories to the front of the camera as well. So how is that process for you? Because this is something that's really important to say, that this is not only reserved for people with high budgets. It's something that all of us can do when we think of the small project as well.
Sure. So my short film was for Durax, and it's centered around sex and real people having real sex. And so it kind of only made sense to actually profile real couples and real people. And that to me meant getting as broad a range of people as possible. So as you mentioned, the crew were all Black and mostly women, and half of them were queer. But then we also had in front of the camera queer couples, straight couples, couples who were poly, couples in which one person was non-binary, and just trying to really mix up as much as possible. Time constraints and budget meant that I couldn't go as far as I would have loved to, but I definitely thought that it wouldn't be an authentic piece of work if there's only one type of person or one type of relationship represented on screen. And that process in and of itself was very easy. Casting it and finding the diversity was easy. It just took work. It wasn't, you spend a lot more time, you have to reach out to a lot more people, forums, Facebook groups, you have to put in the work. But when you do, you get, as long as you're clear about your intentions and clear about those intentions being good, you find that everyone wants to just tell their story and everyone wants to get involved and everyone wants to shout about the person they love because it's who they love. And so definitely I feel like a lot of the time when you don't get diverse cast and crew, it is just laziness. It's not difficult. They're not difficult to find.
And Linda, what do you think from this more of a business perspective? Because I hear a lot of times that people do not want to look for another cinematographer because the project is hard, because the client expects great outcome, and what the work should be done here to, first of all, have faith that we can work with people that we don't know that well, but they will, make the work done. And then to, talk to production studios, and then the production studios should talk to clients, or how this journey should look like.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I might not be the right person to ask about this just because I am a few steps removed from the process. But I think it all comes down to you just got to do it. There's no excuses at this point. Either you're committed to the DE&I statement that you put out last year, or you just were saying it, either you got to show up at some point. And sometimes showing up means you take risks, or you are put into uncomfortable situations, or you have to rely on people that you've never relied on before. And I think that we're definitely at the point, we've been at the point for a while where it's you gotta walk the walk here. And I don't know, it just feels like either you're showing your true colors when you're really not moving forward.
And is it possible to rewrite every story to include someone from underrepresented group in it?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I firmly believe that you can. I don't know if necessarily you need to. I don't know if that's something that's has to happen in every single story, but I think that it's also just not hard. I don't know. It doesn't feel like it should be as difficult as it is, because it's very similar to what Natasha said, where it's just every one of us is a person, and it's just if you really can't see us as people in your films, why bother making films at all? We're all just people, and if you can't integrate people into your work, what are you making work about?
Natasha, what do you think?
I definitely agree. I think if, there's always the argument of whether or not you should just shoehorn diverse people into content for the sake of it. But in my mind, I don't see why it should be an afterthought. I don't see why there's any excuse to look back at a piece of work and only then just realize that everyone is straight and white and able-bodied. And I think if if you're looking to tell a story that only centers that voice, it's really important that the creator is clear about why they want to do that and honest with themselves about why they want to do that. Because it's not, diversity isn't just, you know, a Black person, white person thing. There are so many ways one person could be diverse. There's so many ways a group of people can be diverse. And if you're only telling one very, very narrow story that isn't reflective of the world around us, that's a very, very deliberate action, I feel, and people should be more honest with themselves about why they want to really zone in on that one voice and what's stopping them. Because a lot of the time they'll find that it's, you know, something, and I don't want to say, you know, inherent racism, but there is something, some sort of ignorance that they may not have addressed within themselves that stops them from wanting to collaborate with people who don't look and experience the same sort of perspective that they do.
Yeah, and then I just wanted to drop some funny statistics here because I knew there was like going this direction, but was shocked that it was that number. So the majority of Caucasian people is only 11% of people around the world. So this is something I feel that we need to bear in mind, that this is like the other way around. So yeah, this is just, I think that's really important because it opens eyes to why we are thinking the way we think, I believe. So I think we went through that path a little bit. So I've got this last point put down, big ideas versus small actions. But I think we just drew this line a little bit already because both of you said something that's really important, and it's doable among ourselves. But if you were to summarize a little bit, what are, like, being young creator, young talent, or, you know, filmmaker, however you call it, what are the steps that you definitely can take and need to take towards, you know, fulfilling these ideas that we were talking about?
Definitely being very intentional about who you're working with and whose stories you're telling, and being careful to make sure that whoever's story you're telling, if it's an experience that you yourself don't identify with, be sure to include talent and cast who do identify with that life, and also to include people behind the scenes, and even just paying people, you know, just the average person, paying consultants to just kind of weigh in on that story, basically doing your due diligence and your due research, but also in terms of behind the scenes, making sure that you are looking at those call sheets and thinking, okay, is this reflective of the world around me? Am I giving other people opportunities here, or am I just hiring my friends? And it's easy to do, and it's often kind of like the convenient thing to do, to just lean on someone who you know can do the work and you've worked with them before. But I think it is just a case of making that extra effort to really be strict about what the demographics in your makeup of your crew are, even if it does mean having kind of like a 50% women or non-binary rule, or whether it is a case of saying, okay, we need X amount of people of color. If you're making hard and fast rules, those are hard to kind of bypass because that's concrete. It's not about, we need to do better. It's about, okay, this is what I'm going to do to be better. And if you're kind of strict on yourself and strict on the crew you're working with, then that in itself could go a long way.
This is so true. And Linda, from like more of a, again, business perspective, you mentioned it before, would it be just putting into contracts the numbers?
Yeah, I mean, that could definitely go a long way, especially because of basically exactly what Natasha said, where it's like, if you have those literal hard and fast rules, like you can't really, like, either you break them and your true colors are shown and like people know what you're about, or you step up to the plate and you actually like commit to diversity and like paying talent to be in that space. I also think that from a larger client perspective, definitely like hiring within their company is important. Making statistics easily accessible is important. And then seeking out the right talent is also super important. And I also like will constantly, there is a lot to be said for like mentorship programs, a lot to be said for places like Hue and Free the Work, and places that are like communities committed to diversifying the industry. And I think that everyone should be a part of those communities in order to help uplift the larger like population of people that are not being represented by like the white person or the straight person on camera. So I think that it's like a multi-pronged approach, but definitely like hiring the right people within your company, putting stuff in contracts, and also like as individuals joining groups that promote inclusivity and can help support inclusivity and diversity in your work.
Thank you. So for the last thing, if you were to like really shortly summarize the one per each, advice for the young creators that are just stepping into the industry, because I believe that this is really easier to change people who doesn't have those years of experience of different working specifics. What would that be? What like when they start their careers or they want to proceed like from first or just doing their first movie, being from different places, obviously, what would that be for them to know and to remember and to write down into their notebooks, not to forget?
My advice would be to check your own privilege, because everyone has a degree of privilege to some extent, and often when we belong to minorities as well. So this is for white straight people as much as it is for a person of color who happens to be queer. It's a case of, where do you have privilege and how are you helping to fight that in whatever work you're creating? And I've had to do that myself. I'm able-bodied, I'm a cis straight woman, and a lot of the time I look at my work and I'm not reflecting those communities' experiences, and I've had to go back and I'll rewrite a character, and maybe that person is in a wheelchair and that's part of their story as well. And so a lot of the time it's about looking at ways in which you represent the majority and thinking, it starts with me. How can I kind of make my field and my industry more inclusive for people who don't look like me and don't have the same experiences as me, and then carrying that forward?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I think that that's checking our privilege and understanding our place in the world and how we got there is super important, because sometimes like a lot of us didn't earn our places in the world and just sort of like happened there for one reason or another. I think my bit of advice for young creatives, not necessarily filmmakers, because I'm not a filmmaker, but definitely for young creatives, is like, don't be afraid to fail and don't be afraid to like do better the next time. I think that you can sometimes get caught up in the work that you're doing so much that you don't really, that admitting failure feels like a defeat when it's really just an opportunity for growth. And I feel like, again, it's a lot of letting go of your ego. So I think that that's my advice, is like, don't be afraid to fail. Don't be afraid to apologize. Don't be afraid to like commit to being a better creative, a better writer, a better person, a more inclusive writer, a more inclusive person in the future. Because I think that, especially in our modern age where things are sort of memorialized forever on the internet, we often feel like we have to get it right every single time or else like something will happen. But I think that if we as a community can accept growth, we can be better as like an industry, as a community, as people. So that's my advice, is don't be afraid to fail.
This is a really important one. So thank you both so much. I hope that everybody that joined us learned as much as I did listening to you, because it's not only about things that you remember, but like the change in your mindset that is coming easily just listening to people that like know better, basically. So thank you so much for taking on this challenge about talking about diversity and inclusion, because this talk is really important, but also actions are more important as well. So hopefully this is inspiring, and this will be inspiring for everyone joining and then watching it later, and just coming back to the topic and trying to understand why it's important to, just include it in our work and now in our everyday life. So again, thank you so much. Thank you everyone that have listened to us and will listen to us later. Yeah, a little ad. Thank you ATM system for helping us technically, because yeah, I wanted to make sure everything goes well. So there are no more questions from the comments, so I'll just gonna yeah, thank you again and just end it.
Thank you. See you.
Thank you.